Thanks for joining us here today on Worldview with Mike Lester. Each episode, we have a conversation with ministry leaders or other committed Christians with one simple goal in mind: to learn how to develop a biblical worldview. That way we can be faithful believers at the intersection of theology and life. I invite you to stay connected with us at jmichaellester.com. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. If you find today's episode helpful, please consider sharing it with your friends or even giving us a review. We believe it's important for everyone to know how to have a biblical worldview and to live life correctly where theology and life intersect. And so with that in mind, let's dive into today's topic. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to today's show. I'm excited about our opportunity today to talk with a guest that really, before today, I really hadn't known, except through social media, mutual friends. And I've enjoyed, really, before the show, I spent the last 45 minutes just getting to talk to our guest. I'm excited about what you're going to hear today. I know you're going to be blessed and encouraged by it. I'm speaking today with Jon Beazley, the founder of Explore Christianity. Jon, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks you so much for having me. I really enjoyed our pre-recorded conversation, getting to know you too. I was telling Mike, for those who are listening, it's crazy how social media could just bring you together and you're watching someone else's ministry develop. So I feel like I know Mike, like I've been in your classroom almost.
Yeah, so. I feel the same. Yeah. So I'm glad you're on the show today. And I'm excited about what Explore Christianity has to offer. But I want to stop before we even jump into the story of your ministry. I want to hear a little about Jon Beazley, the man, the Christian, the journey. And to talk about sort of how God began to work in your heart at an early age, and then we can't take an hour to hear your whole story, but sort of give me the big chunks so that our audience has a little bit of a context to understand what brought you to this point, and then the exciting ministry you're a part of now.
Yeah, so I grew up in a Christian home, so I heard the gospel, was very young, and I was saved at a young age. Then when I entered into my teen years, I really went through a phase where I really struggled with some doubts about my own Christian life and connection to Jesus. And I just remember just really going through a season of doubts about all those sorts of things. And having kind of an analytical mind myself, I was already kind of diving into a little bit of the apologetics at a young age, not in a robust way, but just looking for answers and having questions and so forth. But I remember just being helped and hearing good preaching and teaching. It's like, man, I really want to do that. I want to be able to go places and preach the word, preach the gospel, help people in this particular way. So I ended up going to Bible college. And after Bible college, I launched into an itinerant evangelistic ministry. So for a little less than 6 years, I guess altogether, I was traveling in itinerant evangelism, and I loved it. Honestly, it was so fun just being able to minister in different churches, help churches reorient around the gospel, not only just by giving it out, this is how a person becomes a Christian, but also fleshing it out and how this actually changes everything about my life. But most of that time, I still wasn't quite into that apologetic vein. It was more just preaching the gospel, helping Christians in their own spiritual formation, discipleship. But toward the end of my evangelism trail, and then when I was starting to transition more into planning a church, and for those who are listening in, my wife and I went out to Seattle, and we were out there for several years planning a church.
Pretty neat area.
Oh man, I love it. That's another conversation I could jump into for sure. Beautiful area, especially this time of year. The summers in Seattle, it's like heaven. It's great. But I remember towards the end of my evangelism trail, my brother, who was a pastor at a church in Virginia, he began to really hit some difficulties in his life, some like marital struggles, and there was some tension between him and the lead pastor. And there were just a number of emotional struggles that were going on in his life. And he ended up kind of stepping down from the church. And he started working with a guy, I think he was working at Verizon, and the guy had some really tough intellectual questions concerning Christianity.
Sure.
So it was kind of that combination of emotionally struggling with his life, wondering where God was at in all this, the mess. And then he had these big, huge intellectual questions. And he's like, I don't really have an answer for these questions. They're really good. And then he just began to think, oh man, I think I just kind of grew up and assumed all this was true.
Right.
And so he just began to explore different worldviews. And so my brother ended up becoming an atheist.
Wow.
And he's still in that position to this day, even though I think he's kind of coming, like, I don't, not full circle, but he's coming back around to, I think he told me not too long ago, he's like, I don't know if I call myself an atheist. I'm more of an agnostic. So he's starting to see this dogmatic position. He's like, I can't really prove there is no God, but I'm still a bit skeptical. And which is actually kind of neat that he's kind of progressed in that way. And I also would say that my brother and I have like the best relationship right now, which I'm just so thankful for, that we're able to sit down and have pretty robust conversations about Christianity, faith, worldviews, things of that nature. And when I was thinking about my conversation with my brother Seth, I was thinking like, man, I just wish that we saw this happen more often, where non-Christian and Christians could sit down and talk about religion or faith without yelling at each other. Because sometimes it gets so, I don't know, blown
Or
out of
talking
proportion.
past each other.
Oh yeah, talking past each other, slipping into ad hominem, just insulting each other and misrepresenting arguments, but being able to have really good, thoughtful conversations that actually reflect our belief in the Imago Dei, that everybody, regardless of their belief, is created in the image of God, right? And saying, hey, I may not agree with their position, and I may actually be very strong in my words against their position. I can still treat them with dignity and respect, and I can still show them the love of Jesus. How can I preach the love of Jesus and mistreat these people? And I just remembered reflecting on those conversations and being thankful that it took. And now, when it first started, though, when my brother started on this atheism trail, he was very hostile to Christianity. So he would call me, and I'm sure he would be fine with me sharing, but he would just get on and say, you really believe in this stupid God who would blah, 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 blah. And he would fill in the blanks with genocide of the Old Testament, or, condone slavery, or would cosmically, kill and abuse his own son on the cross. You know how people would typically try to paint all these stories. And, but at that time I was like, I don't like the way he's saying it, but we do need to think deeply about these type of conversations. So that put me abruptly, without plan, on this, like, I need to study this more deeply. And then when I was, I'll try to tie this story up so I'm not going too long here, but when I was planning to move out to Seattle, I knew I was moving out to a post-Christian culture.
Yeah.
So Seth, my brother, was just like a small picture of what I would be facing pretty consistently. Except the atheism that I faced out in Seattle was more apathetic in nature. It wasn't as much like hostile to Christianity. There was that, but they were more just like, yeah, we've kind of moved past faith and we don't really feel the need to talk about it. So it was kind of an interesting way, which I'm going to get to. The apologetic takes on a different nature in that type of context, because bringing the typical arguments for the existence of God just falls on deaf ears. Like, they're just not interested in it at all. And so the way we go about helping people see their need for the gospel was a little bit of a different approach, which we'll get to. But yeah, so Seattle was another trying ground. And as a pastor, I found myself preaching apologetically often, even as I'm doing it expositionally. I was thinking, okay, I can't just exegete the text. I need to exegete the community that the Lord's placed me in, and I need to anticipate the objections and questions, which actually, if you follow Pauline's epistles, he does that a lot.
Sure. Yeah.
He's laying out theology and he anticipates,
He asked a rhetorical question and then answers it.
Oh yeah, exactly. Which is a brilliant way of teaching. And so I was kind of like, I want to learn more about how to do both thorough exposition of a text, but also an apologetic bent to it as well, so that when non-Christians come, I'm also anticipating the objections they would have, and Christians as well, because as you know, doing a podcast on worldview, a lot of Christians struggle to maintain a biblical worldview, even though they grew up with hearing it, maybe not embodying it and imbibing it as well. So that's kind of a basic run through. And
so you left Seattle and you started.
I left Seattle. Yeah, I get to explore Christianity here when with the pandemic, and my son, whose name is William, was born with some medical complexities. The combination of pandemic and medical complexity kind of moved us from out of a pastoral role, just didn't feel like we could do that well. And I was just talking to a lot of mentors of mine, and they're like, wow, God's really blessing this apologetic effort. And so they just said, hey, consider making this a actual ministry where you can come and take what you've learned in this journey and come and help other churches and train leaders. So Explore Christianity was birthed out of kind of the pain of being, going through the pain with my brother, being in Seattle and ministering in a post-Christian context, and just my own passion for apologetics. I never imagined jumping at this type of ministry particularly, but I really do. I really love it. I love being able to help people who are struggling with doubt. And I actually failed to kind of mention this too. When my brother was giving me all the intellectual questions, we were going through the struggle of knowing that my son's going to be born with medical complexity. And for months, it just seemed that God was not answering any of our prayers favorably. He was answering them, just not in favor of what we wanted.
Sure.
We just kept saying, God, would you do this? And it was just like, no, no, no. And so I have hanging over me my brother with all these intellectual questions. And I was going through my own emotional struggle. And I was thinking, man, what about my own faith? Do I actually believe these things? So knowing that my brother struggled and I personally struggled, and when I stepped into this ministry, I realized there's a lot of people who are struggling with their faith and they don't know where to go. And they feel like if I go to my family or my pastor, and they feel like maybe they would be criticized or maybe asked to step down from a particular role in a church.
Let me stop you there for a minute, because I'm glad you said that, because I assumed that there were doubts as a teen. I think probably a lot of Christians go through a season where they question some things. But you just alluded to the fact that this was, as an adult as well, with your brother's questions. Was that while you were pastoring?
Yeah, it was.
So I thought so. And I wanted to underscore that because, sometimes I'll have like a church staff member confide in me, and they're like, man, I just really struggle with this, but I'm afraid if I say something to the leadership, maybe I'm not even qualified to be in ministry or something like that. And speak to that for a minute, because you're a pastor at the time and you're having questions that are unresolved. How did you work through that? And how did it affect your ministry positively or negatively?
Well, I think I felt like at one point, like if I'm a pastor, then I believe the gospel, I need to have all the answers to these particular questions. And I didn't know the relationship between having faith and having doubt and allowing them to coexist with each other. And it's not necessarily completely mutually exclusive. Like I can believe the fundamentals of the Christian faith, I'm following Jesus, yet still have doubts about particular things. Like I'm sure you would agree with this too. Like I'm working through some objections that people have towards the character of God in the Old Testament right now. And there's sometimes where I scratch my head and I'm like, ooh, this is a difficult passage, and I don't want to kind of put a Band-Aid on it or just give a quick like, here's the apologetic answer. I really want to sit with this problem and not just come up with a quick answer. And I want to be fine with saying, you know what? I don't know what to do with that passage quite yet.
And the
But it
answer
doesn't
isn't
matter.
just, it isn't just
Yeah.
unhitched from the Old Testament.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. It doesn't have to derail someone's faith.
That's good.
And I think also this was really helpful to me. There are no worldviews that answer all the questions we have. Like, a biblical worldview certainly answers the fundamental questions, like, where did we come from? Who are we? What's wrong with the world?
What's the solution?
Yeah, exactly. So it gives us those fundamentals, but there's a lot of questions that spring from that. Like, and that's where you have the problem of evil and suffering. It tends to be a continual problem people wrestle with. And the Bible doesn't come out and just say, here is yeah, exactly. It does help us frame the problem of evil and suffering, but it doesn't quite answer it in a fully satisfying way. And there's the wisdom of God that we need to trust in that as well. But I do think being able to step back and say, hey, Christian people, atheist, or anything in between, no one has all of the answers to those questions. And it's okay for us not to have all the answers. But when you build this cumulative case for Christianity, you say, you know what, this actually does make a lot of sense in our world. It's not just, theology or this really cool theory. First, Jesus did step into history, and we can go back and examine that history, and there's evidence to that. But then also how Christianity makes the most sense of human nature and how we bring about wholeness, because the world is constantly looking at, like, I'll find wholeness by, generations ago, it was through that shame and honor culture, right? Like, if I just honor the ancestors, I'll be happy. And now it's like, no, I need freedom from all that. It's individualistic, kind of self-autonomy. And we're seeing before our eyes a culture that's everyone's pursuing their own freedom, and it's violating other people's freedom. But we have no framework for morality to actually address the conflict. And so our society is in a mess, right? And I just think that this is an opportunity for us to take the mess and say, hey, there's actually a better story. There's a better way. And this is where the gospel comes in.
So you're in the state of Georgia. I'm in the state of Michigan. And I think the rest of the world is in the state of confusion.
Yes.
That's where we're at. There's so many competing worldviews and so many people. And so what I find is often people will just say something like, well, that's your truth. I've got my truth and you've got your truth. And it's frustrating. I had a conversation Sunday. We went to a friend's house. They had some people over, a little barbecue for the Labor Day weekend. And as I'm talking to this guy, that's a guest, I've never met him. I'm just meeting him first time. And the homeowner who invited me, this guy right here, he has all of the answers. Everything we talked about the gospel, God, how you need Jesus and why you need to go to heaven. He has all the answers. And I'm, oh, great. I hate those introductions, And so his first question to me was, great. I've got a question that I've asked everybody. Where does consciousness come from? Where does it originate? What's the source? And so I looked at him and said, oh, okay, time out. Number one, I don't have all the answers. I appreciate his faith in me. I don't have all the answers. I would not have been able to say that or have wanted to say that 10 years ago, because I felt like, just like you said, I felt like I had to have all the answers. And so instead, what I said was, if we want to talk about what the Bible says, I can give you a good perspective. Let's try to dive deeper into your question. Why are you asking that? What do you really want to know? And it was an interesting conversation. He would be partly pantheistic, partly New Age. And I could see him sitting in a Starbucks in Seattle. That's what I could see him sitting, sort of your own demographic. But the world has questions. And I believe Christianity has answers.
Yeah. Amen. And I think, like, you're hitting on this, I think this point is that we can tell by just society as a whole, and this has always been true, just expressed in different ways. People are looking for something to save themselves. They're looking for something to just, and every couple of years, people are reinventing themselves. It might be like health is going to save me. I'm going to get in really good shape. That's going to save me. Or I'm going to get up out of this hole by my finances or whatever. Or I'm going to become an intellectual. And of course, we have, in the scriptures, a great exegesis of that would be Ecclesiastes, of just like these pursuits are not necessarily bad in themselves, but just when they become God, they become the full end. They just end in chasing after the wind. It's vanity.
Yeah.
And but we see that, and if and this is like the point that I wanted to make. The last couple, I guess, generations in apologetics, the focus has been mainly on philosophical arguments for God. Like, so addressing, like, is Christianity true? Well, let's look at this in several layers. And so you have, going from cosmological to ontological, moral arguments, and then also to Christian theism, dealing with the resurrection of Jesus, historicity of Jesus, and so forth. And I think that those are fundamental and they're very important. But in a culture that has now become more apathetic towards religion as a whole, I think what needs to happen prior to those arguments is a critique of the type of how they're answering the questions. So I can raise the questions about God. They're not interested in it. So if we raise questions about how they actually find what's meaningful to them, so subjects of satisfaction, meaning, justice, liberation, freedom, all these types of things. If you get into those topics, and you could see that their own pursuit of these things actually doesn't work through a secular view. And then we're able to say, hey, can I share with you how the gospel story tells a different story, and how actually you can find it actually provides greater resources for these things. And then what happens, and I think I'm sure you've read Pascal. He talked about first, and I'm not quoting him, I'm kind of paraphrasing him here, but he basically said, you want to first make Christianity rational. So it's not irrational to believe. And then kind of he uses the idea of attractional, but not in the sense like we're trying to make it's not making it something it's not. It's just saying, hey, I want you to see the beauty of this. So at the end where somebody's saying, man, I don't know if it's true, but man, I wish it was true. That sounds really, really good. And then you stop at, and it is true. So it's rational. So it's not illogical. It's actually beautiful. And it actually lines up with reality and our humanity. And also, now let me give you the facts that it is true. And that's where your classical arguments for theism and Christian theism come in. If we start there, though, our culture is more looking at like, what is beautiful, what is meaningful, what is good. And what is painted to them today about Christianity is this. It's a bunch of people who are bigots. They hate people. They're closed-minded. But if we can say, you know what? There is a lot of that is true. There are a lot of Christians that actually don't picture Jesus well at all. And actually just being willing to sit with them if they had a bad experience in church and say, man, I am so sorry that you had that. And then in time, be able to share with them, that's actually not the way of Jesus. That's not the way Jesus' kingdom operates and looks. Can I share that with you? And they begin to see the reality and how it actually interplays with our passion for justice, our desire for satisfaction, our desire for meaning and purpose, and so forth. And I think that's persuasive. And if you look at, sorry to elaborate so long, Mike, but if you look at early church apologetics, they did not focus primarily on like cosmological arguments. I know that wasn't as developed then either with science and things, but they had a little bit of that. And they certainly, in the early church, you had them giving proofs of, hey, Jesus' resurrection, there was these witnesses and so forth. But if you look at like Irenaeus, Tertullian, Justin Martyr, Augustine, these patristic writers really focused on giving a critique of culture and then saying, now let me show you how the gospel is a better way. And they did this over and over and over again. I think it was in 410 that Rome was sacked, and the pagans in Rome were blaming Christians for it. and Augustine wrote The City of God. Are you familiar with that work?
Yeah, yeah. I'm actually reading a book right now, Historical Theology in Depth. And so all these guys you just mentioned, I've been reading about them the last week and a half or so. So yeah.
Yeah. So I've really enjoyed his book, but he basically does give a critique of paganism, and he was showing how their argument that this was Christianity's fault doesn't work, and how actually paganism is at the root of this suffering. And then he begins to paint the beauty of the kingdom of Jesus, hence the name City of God. And I just thought it was brilliant. And I think that's the type of thing. So when we live in a culture where value is relative, where relationships are transactional, identity is fragile, and like suppose fulfillment is disappointing, this is an opportunity for us to come in and say, to have confidence in the gospel and be able to say, hey, this is the better way.
Good.
Let me share with you a different story. And then when you're telling that story and they're like, wow, this is beautiful, but wait a second, how do I know it's true? Then
Right.
there's the apologetics.
No,
now you have interest and curiosity built.
Okay, I need to ask this before I forget. I still haven't mentioned website. My listeners should at least know you have a website. So how would they find you online?
Yeah. So explorechristianity.net is our website, and feel free to drop a question. Like there's a section on the page where you can, if you have a question about Christianity, you can drop that question. So our team, just to dive into, is that okay?
Yeah. Tell me your mission statement too as you're diving into it.
Yeah. So the purpose of Explore Christianity is to help churches equip believers and engage skeptics with the truth, goodness, and beauty of the gospel. So we have those transcendentals, goodness, beauty, and truth. And really, and you see this through church history, a thorough development of how the gospel relates with each one of these transcendentals. And a lot of the Greek philosophers were like, they're trying to understand the nature of goodness, the nature of beauty, the ontological nature of it. But being able to say, hey, we actually could step into this conversation and even to this day, be able to point to the gospel actually helps us understand these on a more robust level. What is goodness? What is beauty? What is truth? And it's centered on the person of Jesus, right? And so we want to help people see the essence and evidence of the Christian faith. Go ahead.
You mentioned you're equipping churches and engaging skeptics.
Yes.
So you have a two-prong attack, if you will, or two-prong mission, I guess.
Yeah. So basically, like the name Explore Christianity is designed to be that invitation for believers to grow in their knowledge of the faith, articulation, defense of the faith, and for doubters and skeptics to come and ask questions and at least learn what is the essence of Christianity. So that mere Christianity idea, and what is the evidence for it. Now, they may not walk away persuaded, but we want to create a context where they can come, they can ask questions, and they're not going to be shamed by asking any question. We just want to create a welcoming context for doubters. And I'm even meaning people who are Christians that doubt. We want to invite them in. And mainly right now that's taking place online. And also when we go to churches, we're trying to help churches create this culture internally, because we know that we don't want to just have a ministry that does this. We want to see all churches that we're able to minister with and help actually create an apologetic culture where people can ask questions. Even like there was a pastor on staff that was struggling. He knew like, hey, this is a safe place for me to ask questions and to work through particular things. So
what do you that's the relationship between discipleship and apologetics?
Yeah. So I think often apologetics is kind of separated. It's almost like here's a class for the nerds, the really smart intellectual people. But according to First Peter and other passages as well, but First Peter particularly says that every believer should be ready to give an apologia, be ready to give that answer. So if that is a part of, and man, that would be a fun, maybe another conversation, but fun to actually look at First Peter 3 in its full context. But flowing from our apprenticeship to Jesus, living out this wholeness that's filled with hope and this, the coming of Christ's kingdom. When you're living this out, he says, like in First Peter, sanctify the Lord God in your heart, and flowing from that, be ready to give an answer. But the precondition for this apologetic is me actually living out this wholeness in Jesus. And people are seeing the holiness embodied, not a holier than thou attitude, but a true wholeness from Jesus. People are like, wow, they have something that I don't have. I'm trying to find it, but they have something unique. And now you have an opportunity to share this apologetic. And so what I would like to see is for every Christian realizing, hey, I'm called upon by God to give an apologetic. And so it's a part of the discipleship process. So I'm called to apprentice after Jesus. I'm a follower of Jesus, and I'm supposed to make disciples. But as you're making disciples, like let's say I'm trying to see someone become a Christian, and I'm sharing the gospel with them, I'm following the Lord's directive there. Inevitably, there's going to come up questions like, you should believe that Jesus Christ is Lord. And they may say, how do we know, like today, here's a big question. How do we know he was an actual historical person? Like, wasn't he just a myth that Christians made up? Well, at that point, it would be good for us now to have an apologetic, to be able to say, that's a really good question. Here's some resources. And at Explore Christianity, we hope to provide those resources so Christians can, in really bite-sized form, be able to say, hey, why don't you read this and we'll talk about it? And they might be able to deal with that objection and so forth.
So
But
we could say
along the way,
we could say apologetics is just an outgrowth of the Great Commission.
absolutely. And I don't think you can do the Great Commission fully without apologetics, really, in any time. Like, people are always inquisitive. When we say, I mean, our faith is historical, right? We're saying Jesus, the Son of God, was, the incarnation. He became a man. He was physically crucified and he resurrected. Well, any intelligent person is going to ask historical questions about that. And they're going to have questions about, well, God and the nature of Christianity. And so there's no way to get around apologetics. And I think the early church really, they believed that from the very beginning. I mean, as a whole, Christianity welcomed the inquisitive, and embedded in their discipleship pathway was apologetics. And I know we were talking beforehand, but the early church followed the pattern of Jesus. Like, they took a good 3 years of intense, like, let's know the story of Christianity. Let's know the doctrine and apologetics that we would accompany Christianity. Let's know Christian ethics and how it's lived out. And they would do that in the pattern of Jesus. If you follow Jesus' ministry, he had these three contexts that Jesus was in. He would go up, he would go in, and he would go out. So the up was up with the Father, in with his disciples, out with the crowds and the masses and serving people. And if you have this rhythm of, we go up together as a church, we worship together, we're in discipleship together, we're out serving the Lord together. If that rhythm is created in a church, combined with like just really careful training through doctrine, through apologetics and so forth, you'll find the church being much more grounded. But I find today that we want to build a church fast, which, again, I'm not against rapid pace growth. I mean, look at the early church. There was explosive growth, right? But I think we want to grow so fast that our breadth has outpaced our depth. And we're struggling with it now because we actually can't engage with a questioning world with any level of depth, because we're just like, well, we really haven't been discipled fully.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. And there's a lot of factors that sort of push people for the fast growth. Your own support, you want to show results, just.
Oh man. Yeah.
Even
with Explore, I mean, we want to grow fast,
yeah.
Right? And with a church, you want to, I'm not pinning wanting to be efficient. I'm all for efficiency and like, how can we maximize our ability to reach more people? I think that's great. I just think that we shouldn't do it at the expense of a good gospel culture and good development of each person, which shows us that we value each person and we're not just trying to build a big platform.
Yeah.
We really value people.
John, I got a lot more questions. I don't think I'm going to be able to finish it all in one episode. Are you open to a second episode?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Totally.
All right. I'm going to invite our listeners to come back for the next podcast. Some things I want to talk about in our next episode, John, just so you know. I want to talk about why you don't have to have a PhD to do apologetic work. I mean, sometimes people think that I have to be C.S. Lewis or I have to be William Lane Craig or Gary Habermas. I've got to have this degree behind or else people are going to ask me questions I can't answer. I'd like to talk about how it's everyday apologist. So have that in your mind. I want to talk to you about as well the resources that you offer from Explore Christianity and how that can help my listeners. And then I'd like to just find out how our listeners can be a part of helping to your vision and your mission to grow. And so that's some things we'll talk about in our next episode. So I want to invite our listeners to come back. John, I've enjoyed our first half here, and I look forward to our second half as well. I'll see you guys in the next episode.
It's been great. Yep.
All right, see you in the next episode. Thanks for joining us here today at Worldview with Mike Lester. I hope you've been encouraged and challenged. If you have, take a moment and share this episode with your friends on social media as well. And if you're looking for more valuable, helpful resources, feel free to look at jmichaellester.com. I'll see you in the next episode. Once again, Mike Lester here with Worldview. See you soon.